Okay, we've reached our final section. And in a lot of ways, this may be the most important one. Because here's the thing. Everything we've talked about so far, the sampling, the experiments, the data, all of it involves real human beings. And whenever we collect information about people, we also take on a responsibility. We have to think about privacy, consent, fairness, and how that information is going to be used. So in this section, we're going to talk about ethics. What responsibilities do researchers have when they collect data about people? How should that data be handled? And what happens when those responsibilities are ignored? Let's get into it. So here's the core question I want you to carry with you. Not just through this course, but honestly, anytime you work with data in the future. Just because we can collect certain data or run a certain study, does that automatically mean we should? Those are two very different questions. Can we and should we? That space between those two questions is exactly where ethics lives. And I want you to understand something important. The ethical rules we use today did not appear out of nowhere. Many of them were created or strengthened in response to real cases where people were seriously harmed. So let's walk through the timeline on the slide. First, the Nuremberg Code, created in 1947. It came after the world learned about horrific medical experiments carried out on human beings during World War II, often without meaningful consent. One of the central principles that came out of this was that voluntary consent is absolutely essential. People have the right to understand what they're agreeing to, and they have the right to choose whether they participate. Next, we have the Willowbrook study, which took place from the 1950s into the 1970s. Researchers deliberately exposed children at a state institution to hepatitis. And serious questions were raised about whether parents were truly free to refuse participation. And this case highlights two major ethical problems. First, consent is not truly voluntary if someone is being pressured or coerced. And second, vulnerable populations, especially children, require greater protection, not less. Then, in 1979, came the Belmont Report. This laid out three major ethical principles that still shape human subject research today: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. We're going to talk about what those principles mean in a moment, but first, I want you to notice the bigger lesson. The reason these protections exist is not theoretical. People were harmed when researchers failed to protect them. So ethics is not an extra step we add after the statistics are finished. It has to be part of the study from the very beginning. Okay, so let's get practical. What does ethical research actually look like day to day? There are 5 key principles, and they're the 5 cards you see on the screen. Let's go through them one at a time. First, informed consent. People have to voluntarily agree to participate in a study. But that agreement only means something if they actually understand what they're agreeing to. So, before they participate, they need to be told the purpose of the study, the possible risks, and the possible benefits. And they also have the right to withdraw at any time without being punished or pressured. Nobody should be tricked, trapped, or forced into participating. Second, IRB oversight. IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. This is an independent committee that reviews research involving human participants before the study begins. So, for example, imagine a professor here wants to study student stress during finals week. They can't just start collecting personal information from students. They would first need to submit a research plan, explain how participants will be protected, and receive the appropriate approval. Third, confidentiality. Researchers have a responsibility to protect people's identities and private information. That might mean removing identifying information, using ID numbers instead of names, storing the data securely, and reporting results as group summaries, rather than identifying individual participants. Because even if the research question seems harmless, a privacy breach can still cause real harm. Fourth, do no harm. This principle is often connected to the idea of beneficence. The goal is to maximize the potential benefits of the research while minimizing the risks. And those risks are not only physical, they can also be psychological, social, financial, or related to privacy. Good researchers have to think about all of those possibilities before the study begins. And fifth, honesty and integrity. This means no making up data, no changing results because you don't like what they show, and no plagiarism. It also means reporting results honestly, including findings that don't support your original idea. And researchers should disclose important conflicts of interest, including who funded the study, so other people can evaluate the evidence for themselves. So those 5 principles are informed consent, IRB oversight, confidentiality, do no harm, and honesty, and integrity. Together, they form the backbone of responsible research. Because good research is not only about getting an answer, it's also about getting that answer in a way that respects and protects the people behind the data. Now, here's what makes this even more interesting. Technology has created ethical questions that barely existed a generation ago, and a lot of them still don't have simple answers. Let's look at 3 examples. First, privacy in the digital age. Here's the tricky part. Even when data is supposedly anonymous, sometimes people can still be identified by combining that data with other information. There's a famous example involving Target. The company analyzed customers' shopping patterns and used those patterns to predict things like pregnancy. In one widely discussed case, pregnancy-related coupons were sent to a customer before some members of her own family knew she was pregnant. And that raises a very real ethical question. Just because a company can figure out something extremely private about you, does that mean it should? Especially when you never chose to share that information directly. Second, social media research. Back in 2014, Facebook conducted a large experiment involving almost 690,000 users. Researchers changed what appeared in people's news feeds. Some users saw slightly more positive content, while others saw slightly more negative content. Then researchers looked at whether that affected the emotional tone of what those users posted themselves. But here's where the controversy came in. Users were not specifically told that they were participating in this particular experiment. And that led to a much bigger debate about consent. If you clicked "I agree" on a long terms of service agreement years ago, does that really mean you agreed to participate in a psychology experiment? That's a much harder question. And many people would argue that meaningful consent should require more than that. Third, data security. As researchers and companies collect more and more sensitive information, the consequences of a data breach become much more serious. A breach might expose someone's medical information, financial information, location history, or other deeply personal data. So, protecting that information is not just a technical issue, it's an ethical responsibility. Researchers need to think about things like encryption, limiting who can access the data, storing it securely, and safely destroying sensitive information when it's no longer needed. And here's what I want you to notice about all 3 of these examples. These are not completely settled questions. Technology keeps changing, and our ethical rules have to keep catching up. These are exactly the kinds of problems your generation is going to have to think through. Not just what can technology do, but also what should we allow it to do? And Where should we draw the line? Okay, let's bring it all home. We covered a lot in this module, so I want to leave you with 5 things I really want you to remember. They're all on the screen. Number 1, statistics turns data into decisions. And sometimes, those decisions really can be life or death. Remember the challenger. Number 2, know your data, its type, and its level of measurement. Determine what kind of analysis actually makes sense. You can't average a zip code. Number 3, only a well-designed experiment can give us strong evidence of causation. Observational studies can show us association, but they cannot, by themselves, prove cause and effect. So let's say it one more time. Correlation is not causation. Number 4, sample well. Use randomization when you can. And always stay alert for things like bias, non-response, and lurking variables hiding in the background. And number 5, this is the one I most want to stick with you. Behind every single data point, there is a person. So, consent, privacy, and honesty always matter. And that's Module 1. You now have the foundation for everything else we're going to build on this term. So here's my one homework request. Before you even open the textbook, when you go back out into the world today, start noticing the statistics around you. On your phone, in advertisements, in the news, on social media. And instead of just accepting every number you see, start asking better questions. Where did this number come from? Who was included? Who might be missing? And should I actually trust it? Because that, right there, is exactly what a statistically literate person does. Nice work today, and I'll see you in the next module.